but you actually played golf with someone who couldn't form new memories.
And there he was teeing the ball up again. I said, well, why are you doing that? You just hit a great drive. He said, I did? He had no idea.
How accurate do you think you are in predicting about your memory and also your past memories?
When I won the club championship, it was written up in the newspaper, and so I look at that every day. No, I don't look at the write-up every day, but I've looked at it from time to time.
We're going to talk a little bit about your background, obviously, and get into 7 Sins of Memory, but we've got lots and lots of other cool things to talk about, including we get to continue to talk about golf and your golf experiences. One of the things I'm going to ask you about, because I think this is a really cool story, is when you played golf with an amnesic, and an area that you've talked about a lot in your 7 Sins. We'll talk about all this, but first, let's talk about you. You are the chair of Harvard Psychology Department, have been for quite a while. You're obviously...
I was chair.
You were? You have resigned?
I have not been
chair?
for a while.
Oh, wow. When did that happen?
I was for 10 years, but that's now in the past.
Wow. I still think of you as the chair for Harvard Psychology Department. So, yeah, I mean, lots of awards. I'm not going to go through the whole list of them, but just a few. Both of your books, actually. 7 Sins, obviously, one of the New York Times Notable Book Award, but also your Searching for Memory book is also very well regarded, and another Notable Book Award for the New York Times. The William James Award for Book Award as well, which I think is a little bit interesting since you are in William James Hall at Harvard.
True.
And then the Warren Medal for the Society of Experimental Psychology, and of course National Academy of Sciences, on and on and on. And you know, Dan, we've known each other for years, but still I continue to be impressed and enjoy the presentations that I've gotten to hear basically every year for the last 20 years. So we're going to talk about a lot of that as well. But we're going to start off, if you don't mind, talk a little bit about your journey to where you are now. You know, where you grew up. We were just talking about Winged Foot Golf Course, where you grew up, how you got involved in memory, although, you know, I know it's been a lifelong passion for you, but can you just give us a quick background about that area?
Yeah, I grew up in Westchester County in just outside of New York City. Initially New Rochelle, and then Scarsdale, where I went to Scarsdale High School, and that's where I developed my interest in golf. But at the same time, in my junior year, I took a health course that had a significant psychology component. And that's what really got me interested in psychology for the first time. It was a bit more focused on traditional clinical psychology, Freud and the like, but really sparked my interest. Then when I went off to college at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, I, from the outset, was a psychology major. So I did all the things psychology major would do, again, with the focus on primarily on clinical psychology. During my junior year, I had an internship involved with trying to modify self-injurious behavior.
Sorry, Dan, can you describe what that is?
Yeah, so these were very mentally impaired young adults and teens who would engage in all kinds of self-harming behaviors. And the question is, how could you stop that? How could you reduce that? Because it posed the risk to their health. And so there's a professor at UNC who was interested in whether you could use behavior modification techniques to reduce this self-injurious behavior, and had some success with it. So I was, as a psychology intern, helped out with some of those studies and just observed these individuals. And then as I was going through my senior year, I was offered a position as a research assistant on a project further extending this work on self-injurious behavior and severely mentally impaired individuals, and accepted it. At the same time, however, I was starting to develop some interest in experimental psychology, and a teaching assistant in my statistics course was doing some work over at nearby Duke University with another researcher where they were looking at things like altered states of consciousness, sleep, even parapsychology and ESP and what might be going on in the brain, if anything at all related to that. And so they kind of got me involved a little bit in their research. And through them, these folks at Duke, I was put in touch with a cognitive psychologist by the name of Herb Krovitz, sensing that my interests were shifting from this clinical focus more toward an experimental focus. And Herb Krovitz worked on perception and memory at Duke and the Durham VA hospital. And he had an opening for a research assistant. And I had already committed to taking this other job. So I thought, well, why am I even interviewing for this position with Krovitz? But then I felt my interest really had shifted toward that kind of work and away from the other stuff. Long story short, we kind of hit it off. He offered me a position. I accepted it. And in the fall of 1974, I began working for Herb Krovitz as a research assistant at Duke and the Durham VA hospital. And his work had primarily focused on perception, but was shifting into memory. And being at a VA hospital, he was starting to see some patients with brain damage who had various kinds of memory problems. And as his research assistant, was the person who would be doing the initial front-end testing on these folks. And I really knew nothing about memory, and I had no experience testing these memory impaired individuals, but I was really intrigued and even blown away, you might say, by what I observed in testing these patients, because on the one hand, they seemed perfectly normal. You could have a normal conversation with them. They came off as, in most cases, they were older individuals, as normal, cognitively intact, elderly folks. But then what was striking is, for example, if you went out of the room and came back 5 minutes later, these seemingly normal people might have no idea who you were, no memory of the fact that I'd just been testing them for an hour. And that was really something that stunned me and got me interested in memory. And then through working with Krovitz, I eventually in the fall of 1976, went off to graduate school at the University of Toronto, which is kind of a world center for memory research, and was fortunate to be taken on as a graduate student by Endel Tolving, one of the world's foremost memory researchers, who sadly passed away this past September. But I had the great good fortune to work with him at Toronto. So that's really how my journey in memory got started.
So, you know, it's interesting, Dan. I hadn't thought about this until you're just telling the story now. But, you know, initially, your interest in psychology was in a clinical perspective. What was it about the clinical psychology that was interesting to you?
Oh, I think it was just a chance to see departures from, you know, the normal human cognitive psychological function, to see how different conditions could arise, either psychopathology, or in the case of self-injurious behavior, these extreme kind of behaviors that resulted from intellectual problems. So I think it was that. And then, even though I then shifted toward experimental, I think something analogous with amnesic patients really is what struck me, and probably was the key thing in propelling me forward in memory research, was just seeing the ways in which memory impairment could manifest and how striking and counterintuitive it was.
It's interesting because as you're describing it, that thread that goes through all of your interests and research has been some area off of just normal functioning, right? In a variety of different ways, which seems like that thread that's gone through all of your interests and most of your research over the years. By the way, just as an aside, I may have mentioned this before to you, but my dad also is from New Rochelle. And
I didn't know that.
yeah, for years before you, he's 97 now, so he was gone off to the war before you ever got around there. But the whole family was from New Rochelle. It's a beautiful, beautiful area, right there.
It is. Yeah.
So, so it's interesting because when you talk about, your most famous book is Seven Sins of Memory, and the sins are really aligned with that idea. What are some of the things that can happen if memory doesn't go right for a whole variety of reasons? So let's jump into that because you've had huge success with the first edition. A few years ago, you published a second edition, which was the 20th anniversary, also a huge success of that. So if you don't mind, let's go through the seven sins and what you've noticed as the changes between the original book 20 plus years ago and the newer version. I know a lot of this comes from your lab, so let's just walk through that. And if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of jump in and ask you some questions along the way.
Yeah, sure. Feel free to ask any point. So let's just rattle off the seven sins, and then we'll walk through some of the things that I found, most interesting from the 20-year for the 20-year update. So the first three I call the sins of omission, and they all can be broadly described as forgetting, but they're different aspects or different mechanisms of forgetting. So I refer to them as transience, absent-mindedness, and blocking. Transience refers to forgetting over time, the fact that all other things being equal, memories are more difficult to remember as more time passes, versus less time. It's harder to remember what happened a year ago versus a week ago, all other things being equal. The second one, absent-mindedness, is forgetting, but forgetting that happens for a different reason than with transience. It's not a question of information fading over time. Rather, it's a breakdown at the interface of memory and attention. So that, for example, I'm preoccupied with thinking about an upcoming task. I lay my keys or my glasses down. I pay no attention to that, and then I can't remember where they are. So that would be an example of absent-minded forgetting. It's not loss of information over time.
So if I may, we're going to talk about this a little bit more, the influence of, I'm going to call it social influence or technology influence of multitasking and so forth. Would that fit into the same definition, or are you going to have a different definition for those multitasking errors?
I think multitasking errors would fit most sensibly with absent-mindedness. Mm-hmm. Technology, more broadly, the effects could be on any and all of these memory sins. But we'll come back to multitasking in a minute.
Okay.
And then the third of the sins of omission I call blocking. So that's where information is available in memory. It hasn't faded over time like with transience. You're paying attention, you're trying to remember, but you just can't come up with information that's stored in memory at the moment that you need it. So the most familiar example for most of us would be the tip of the tongue phenomena. We're asked about certain kind of information. We know that we know it. It feels like it's on the tip of our tongue, most typically with proper names. We may know all kinds of things about the person. We can't come up with a name, and we come up with it at a later time showing that it was there all along.
I just had that before we got on camera. I had that experience with trying to remember the central character of Caddyshack, and finally Danny Noonan came to mind, but it was tip of the tongue. And it's... it's frustrating when that happens as well. I've heard people talk about senior moments with this, which I have been having lately. So just in general, Dan, there's the sort of normal state where these things happen because they happen to people just normally. And then there's the state that goes beyond a normal state. And you talk about this a lot in the book as well. And that's the central theme that we've talked about before, where, these anomalies that go outside of our normal window of memory progressions and so forth. So, this is, I got to tell you, we've talked about this before, but this is really interesting to me to actually have the conversation with you about it and be able to take these apart a little bit. So, let's keep going because I'm getting more and more excited about talking about this.
Yeah, if we think of the kind of clinical manifestations or exaggerations of these different sins, we know, for example, transience, we would think of the amnesic syndrome as being the condition in which transience is exacerbated. The kinds of patients who I tested back at the VA hospital would be cases in which forgetting over time is exaggerated. With absent-mindedness, that's not really, we don't think of that as being manifest so much in amnesic patients as, for example, patients with frontal lobe damage who have deficits in attention. And so they may appear forgetful, but not for the same reasons as an amnesic patient. And then with blocking, that is the most common complaint of just normal aging, particularly for names, name blocking. That happens to all of us as we get older. And there have been some very interesting neuropsychological studies about patients with particular kinds of cortical lesions who have severe deficits in blocking, for example, for proper names above and beyond anything that we would see in an otherwise cognitively intact individual. Then moving on to the sins of commission. So these are cases in which memory is present, but it's either wrong or unwanted. So 3 of them have to do with different kinds of memory distortion. So misattribution occurs when we remember some aspect of an event correctly, but get the source wrong. So you might tell a friend, hey, I learned this really interesting new fact. I think it was my friend Mark who told me, and it turns out it was somebody else who told you, or you heard it on the radio, or you saw it on the internet. So you got the fact right, but you got the source wrong. You misattribute it to the wrong source. Very common kind of memory distortion and involved in all kinds of interesting phenomena such as false recall and false recognition.
So, Dan, with this in mind, then it seems like there are 2 processes associated with memory specifically related to this, right? One is that you're encoding the fact, and 2, you're encoding the context, for example, the individual who's giving you the fact. So does this suggest that there are 2 different pathways or 2 different mechanisms for those memories?
Yeah, I think there is some degree of independence or separation between those 2. And I think we should always think of memory as kind of a multi-dimensional event. Many different aspects of an experience can potentially be retained, but certainly probably somewhat different pathways for item and source information. I think most of us would agree.
So, one of the things that I remember learning about context-dependent memory, where when we're in this similar context, when we encode versus when we decode, we're more likely to remember it, right? So, for example, if I go back to my grade school, I may have forgotten a story about Miss Janicek, my kindergarten teacher, but then I go back to grade school and I'm like, oh yeah, I remember Miss Janicek, right? That context is cueing those memories. And so I'm struggling a little bit with this. So I'd like your thoughts about it. To me, we are encoding the context and the information together, and context becomes a really important cue to that. But now we're talking about where there's misattribution, where essentially the context, the information is correct, but the context is not. And so it's
Right.
almost like there was a decoupling at some point of the encoding of these two things together.
Exactly. And there's some very dramatic examples of that. People who are old enough will remember back in the days after the Oklahoma City bombing, there was a nationwide manhunt for two individuals, John Doe number one and John Doe number two. John Doe number one turned out to be Timothy McVeigh. We know was convicted and executed for his role in the bombing. John Doe number two was never found. And it turned out that John Doe number two was apparently the result of a classic kind of memory misattribution error. So it was based on the memory, the testimony of a guy who had been present at the body shop where McVeigh rented the van that he used to carry out the bombing. And he distinctly remembered that there were two people there that day, McVeigh and then this other guy who he gave a detailed description of. Well, it turned out after they couldn't really find anybody who fit the characterization of John Doe number two, that the person who did fit it was someone who was at the body shop the next day, accompanied by another guy who sort of looked like McVeigh. And this person's misattributed memory was accurate in many respects. He remembered details of this guy that he attributed to John Doe number two, that he was wearing a Carolina Panthers cap. He had a Playboy bunny tattooed on his arm. Those things were true, but of this other guy who had nothing to do with the bombing and was in the same body shop the next day. So there's a classic kind of misattribution where the context and the becomes sort of decoupled from other aspects of the event.
Well, I don't want to derail us too much because on this, we can get to it later, but you're bringing up an important point. These are, in some cases, these are annoyances for us, right? Tip of the tongue, for example, or misattribution. These are annoyances in a normal situation. But there are other places where, in particular in legal situations, eyewitness testimony and so forth, that these have some really significant consequences as well. And so, again, we can talk about this later, but I think it's important for folks to know that in a normal situation, it's a really interesting studies, and they can tell us a lot about memory. But the application of this can be really devastating in people's lives.
Right, absolutely correct. And one of the things we know is that eyewitness misidentifications, sometimes involving the kind of misattribution errors that we're talking about, are involved in the majority of wrongful convictions of folks who are later exonerated of their crime on the basis of DNA evidence. This is something that the Innocence Project has done a good job of establishing and tracking over time, now with a very large number of cases. So yeah, the consequences of these kinds of errors can be severe. And one thing to keep in mind is that one reason why, for example, misattribution can be so potentially dangerous is that some aspect of the memory is correct. The guy who remembered, seeing the John Doe number two in the body shop did see him, but he saw him the day after that he saw McVeigh. So misattribution errors I think are particularly potentially dangerous because people are remembering something correctly. It's just that they've got the context wrong.
Yeah, and then this becomes more pronounced as the person retells the story over and over again, which, we're going to talk about as another area of commission in this.
Yes. Yeah, and that sort of leads to the next one I call suggestibility. And suggestibility is somewhat closely related to misattribution, but here we have some sort of misinformation being fed into the memory system, a suggestion about something that might have happened or could have happened, but in many cases did not happen, that becomes incorporated into memory, misinformation. This goes back to some of the classic studies of Elizabeth Loftus and her colleagues many years ago. It's been shown many times, and we know that aggressive, suggestive questioning to people about events that might have happened can sometimes result in implanted memories. So these suggested memories always involve some kind of misattribution, but there's something else involved as well.
It's, I'm reminded of the classic story about how an attorney questioning an eyewitness, for example, for a car accident, can bias the person's recollection later when they're in court by simply changing a word. How fast was the green car going when it bumped into the red car versus how fast was the green car going when it smashed into the red car, and how that has some really significant implications of it. And what it comes down to is this idea that we have a fallible memory in that regard, which, obviously is the point of seven sins. So yeah, just a little bit your thoughts about that idea, about how when we reconstruct a memory, if we have someone who is helping us reconstruct that memory, they may be helping us reconstruct a fallible memory.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that falls under the broad construct of suggestibility. And I think when we're most vulnerable to that is when we're trying to remember something maybe from the distant past, or something about an event that we didn't have a clear view of or don't have a very, strong memory of. So that memory is prone to being filled in by outside information. And so the example you cite that goes back to some of the classic work of Loftus made that point early on, and we've seen other, other examples of it since that time.
And I think that this is also another less nefarious example of this is you've seen these older couple videos where the two, the husband and wife, are telling a story, and it's supposedly the same story, and yet their version of it is quite a bit different, and it actually incorporates several of the areas of commission that you've been talking about as well, when they end up having, it was the same event, but the story is very, very different between the two.
Right. And another one of the sins that can contribute to that is the one that I call bias. That's the third of the distortion-related sins. And this refers to the fact that our memories are not just, again, activating a photographic record of what happened, but rather are recreated or reconstructed in line with our current knowledge, beliefs, and attitudes. So that information about what we presently currently think, know, believe, and feel can skew or bias our reconstruction of the past. And that may be one of the reasons why, two members of a couple might have a different recollection of the same event. It might be because they're now reconstructing it from, different viewpoints, and their memories being biased by different factors in the present. And there are a lot of nice experimental examples of that.
There's a quote by Annis Nin that says, "We don't see the world the way it is, we see the world the way we are." And it really sounds like it's speaking to that bias, right? That
I think so, yeah.
Our interpretation is largely based on maybe our mindset at the time, or or just the things that we are paying attention to get to another point. And attention becomes a huge piece of memory, as you talk about in the book.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, for sure. I think this is one of the more insidious of the memory sins, because I think it's more subtle. It's happening a lot of the time in memory. It's hard to completely dissociate your memory of a past event from your current feelings, attitudes, and beliefs. So I think it's one of the more subtle but pervasive ways in which memory can depart from what actually happened.
Yeah.
And
It's
then the
interesting.
final one of the seven, oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna go ahead, please. Yeah.
The final, just to get through the seven sins, the final one I call persistence. And this is another sin of commission in that memory is present, but now memory is present, but unwanted, unwelcome. So now we're talking about intrusive memories of what might be traumatic events that we can't get out of our mind. That's one of the things we know about highly arousing experiences, is that they're the kinds of things that, as we all know, can keep us up at night. And in the result, and in the extreme case of trauma, can result in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So this persistence can be, psychologically disabling. So in some ways, it might be the most debilitating of these seven sins.
Yeah. So just to be clear, when you're referring to arousing, you're referring to, arousal of the central nervous system. So somebody could be angry, they could be very sad, they could be, all of these different things that are causing a heightened state to be able to, when they're encoding this information in memory.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All those factors can play into it. And persistence also raises another point. I want to make sure that I mention this because I think it's so important. And this goes to kind of the higher level way in which I conceptualize these seven sins. Even though, for example, persistence can be psychologically disabling on the one hand, on the other hand, we want to have a memory system that will preserve experiences that, could threaten us, as disturbing as they might be. From that perspective, the memory system, that gives rise to persistence is an adaptive one, because it's going to help us to remember threatening experiences that could impact our survival. And so that raises the more general point, which I try to make, or I made in the final chapter of the 2001 book, version of the book, the first edition, which is that, in fact, although I call them sins, we're better off, I think, conceptualizing these various memory sins as prices we pay for a memory system that works pretty well most of the time. They're costs we pay for adaptive features in memory that make the system work generally very well.
This is a really important point that you're making. I want to go back to it because it's not, like you just said, they're not necessarily sins. There are things that are adaptive, even from an evolutionary perspective. I think about you were explaining something that I want to talk about this a little bit, predictive memory, but you explained something to me one time, which I thought was just absolutely fascinating and simple at the same time. So if I'm driving from home to work, something I've done many, many times, my memory is constantly testing and making predictions about what's happening. And if those predictions are correct, the weather, the traffic flow, the experiences I have, the types of cars I see, and so forth, I basically don't remember that, right? Because there was no real reason for me to waste valuable resources to encode additional information. But if there's something that comes up, like I got cut off in traffic, or there's a uniquely colored car or something, I'll remember that. Not only will I remember that, but then I'll tell people, oh, you wouldn't believe what happened on my way to work. There's a really adaptive aspect to this, right? I mean, and again, not thinking about us in today's world, but thinking about us in a previous world, that's essentially not only encoding the information stronger for me, so I know that that's potentially dangerous, but it's also giving other people a clue in my tribe that they know that this is potentially dangerous. And so I think that this point, I love this point because it's easy to say these are all problems, but there is some adaptability and some utility to some of these issues. And I love the fact, by the way, that you added that chapter.
I think a lot of it centers around the point which you were making, which is that, again, it wouldn't come as a shock to people, but that a lot of the features of memory that we're describing support our ability to remember what's most important, because that's what grabs attention, and that results in a more elaborate encoding of that information that's more likely to persist over time. And as you point out, those are things that we're likely to retrieve in our own minds and communicate to others. So you have a whole cascading number of features that all support memory for the more important stuff, and the less important stuff may never be encoded to begin with.
There's a quote that I heard that fits with that. It's I may be having an attribution error here, but I think it's from the book Made to Stick by Dan and Chip Heath. And it said, nothing focuses attention like surprise. And it seems to fit with exactly what you're saying right there. Yeah, I think surprise would be among those constellation of factors that drive this sort of effect of importance on various aspects of memory, yes. So, Dan, can we go through a couple of examples and then you tie them back to one or more of the 7 sins of memory? So, for example, I think about confirmation bias in a medical environment. So an individual comes in and they have a patient who's psychotic, for example, and as a result of that, the physicians oftentimes will have a bias about what might be going on with that individual. And to do a thorough assessment, what would be in the best interest of everyone is if they could take a step away from that bias to see what's happening. Their bias may be correct, by the way, but they may also miss things if they can't step away from that bias. How does that fit into the 7 sins?
Yeah, I think that would fit in with one aspect of what I call bias, where your past experience in this case is maybe useful, maybe for the most part is useful. That's why you have the bias to begin with. But as you point out, when there's a departure from the norm, or there's a departure from your prior experience, it may blind you to something that's very important. So yeah, I think that would be one nice example under the general rubric of what I call bias.
There's a book, you may know this, called How Doctors Think. And I'm pretty sure that's the title. And one of the things that they recommend in that is to ask the question, what else could it be? And so that seems like a potential mechanism or strategy to be able to get away from this bias. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that makes sense, because you need something that's going to take you out of your kind of default expectation. Even if the default expectation is going to be right 80 or 90% of the time, you need a kind of a cognitive maneuver to at least encourage you to ask the question of whether there might be another way of looking at it. So that makes a lot of sense to me, yes.
I never thought about this until I was just listening to you say that, but the tip of the tongue phenomenon, one of the things that has always occurred to me is if I think a person's name starts with L, for example, and it turns out it doesn't, I won't be able to remember that person's name because I'll be sort of stuck down that route of L, 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 L. And it's not until, as you said, later on, when I essentially forget that I'm trying to remember the person's name, then it just kind of pops into my head. That's kind of like what is happening with the physicians, that they can walk in with a particular bias and they're just looking for that, ailment that's happening with the individual. So even when I think that person's name starts with an L, maybe I can ask, what other letter could it start with? I mean, it's much less of an issue than a medical diagnosis, but that might be
Right.
helpful just in every day.
Hmm. Yeah, I think when you get stuck in a memory rut like that, you've got to be a little bit creative in trying to think of ways to get out of it.
So another question. By the way, before this podcast, we asked folks on Instagram, some of the people who follow us, what are some things that are interesting to you? And one of the questions that they asked about is more along the lines of learning than memory. And so I want to set this up and have you define this for us. So a lot of people think about memory as being essentially a storage place for information. You talk about it in addition to that as having a predictive quality, which I think is really important. So let's start there, and then we'll get to the differences between learning and memory.
Yeah, I think one of the main issues we've been pursuing in my lab for the past 15 years now is the idea that memory is not just for going back into the past and reflecting on what's happening and reminiscing and so forth, but rather using information from our past experience in a flexible way to think ahead, to imagine and simulate upcoming future events. That's one of the really critical things that we need memory for. It's all very well and good to be able to go back into the past and reminisce, but we really want to use it so that we can more effectively deal with what's coming at us in the future. And the way we saw this initially was through functional MRI studies where we put people in the scanner and we did a very simple experiment where we would ask them to either remember a past experience or imagine a future experience in relation to a simple cue word. So if I gave you a cue word like vacation and said, try to remember a past experience that's happened to you from the past few years related to vacation, you might remember the vacation you took in Florida last winter and elaborate on that. If I gave you a cue word such as dog, and I said, now imagine a future event that could plausibly happen to you in the next couple of years involving a dog, you'd say, well, I could imagine wanting to get a new puppy, and I imagine going to the pet store and picking out a new puppy. And what we saw very strikingly was that the same network of brain regions came online when we remembered the past and imagined the future compared to various control tests that we gave participants. And others were reporting this striking similarity at around the same time. And so based on these and some other findings pointing toward this similarity between remembering the past, imagining the future. For example, older adults. As we get older, we tend to remember less specific detail from our past experience. If I ask you to go back and remember a specific experience that occurred, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, you'll tend to produce less detail as you get older into your 60s, 70s, and 80s compared to someone in their 20s or 30s. Well, when we ask people to imagine into the future about something that might happen to them, so it might be, for example, imagine a future experience related to vacation and tell us all about that, that we got less episodic details about who would be there, where the event would happen, how events would unfold. We got less of that from older adults than younger adults, with the difference being parallel to what we would see if we asked them to remember a past experience. So these and other striking similarities encouraged us to conceptualize memory in terms of its value for thinking about the future, and the idea that one thing our memory is very good at is taking in a flexible way bits and pieces of past experiences and recombining them to imagine novel upcoming events, because after all, the future is rarely identical to the past. So we want to be able to imagine novel upcoming events, and we think that's one of the things that our flexible memory system is particularly good at. But we think that very flexibility might be implicated in some of the memory errors that we were talking about earlier, such as misattribution, the guy who mixed up seeing the alleged accomplice to Timothy McVeigh from two different days at the body shop. That might be a manifestation of a flexible memory system that's really set up to allow us to use past experience to imagine novel events. But one of the consequences of that flexibility might be our vulnerability to misattribution and some of the other errors we talked about.
So one of the things that I hear you saying is that an individual's ability to remember past events and the details of those past events for that individual is similar to that individual's ability to predict or imagine future events as well. Does that sound correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting.
But I would say that I wouldn't use imagine and predict interchangeably.
Yeah.
I would say that it's related to their ability to imagine future events.
Mm-hmm.
I think prediction is closely related, but not exactly the same thing.
I think it's a great point because prediction could be based on experience, right? So an older adult may be better at predicting something based on experience,
Exactly.
but they may not be able to imagine. So one of the things that strikes me as you're saying this is, our ability to remember something that's coming, that will come, is partially based on our ability to imagine that thing. So, for example, if I think that I'm going to go to a social event and I'm going to see certain things at that social event, I think about, okay, I'm going to see this, I'm going to see that, and so forth. Then I have some context, some perspective to be able to assess that. And after that social event, I either did see those or I didn't see those, but I'm more likely to remember because essentially I pre-cued myself to think about certain things.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, in an academic setting where I think I'm going to learn about this during the lecture because I've read through my syllabus, I'm more likely to remember whatever the information is because I have pre-cued. One of the studies I remember about this is reading a title to a paragraph before you read the paragraph. And in one case, they read the title and the paragraph. In another case, there was no title. They just read the paragraph. Those people who read the title than the paragraph were much better at remembering the paragraph than the others. Anyway,
right, the paragraph is constructed so that if you don't get the title, the individual sentences, it's not obvious how they connect to one another, but the title ties it all together.
Yeah, so it sounds like sort of the nuanced nefariousness of this is if an older adult, for example, can't imagine the future with details, then they're less likely to remember the future with details. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Depends exactly what you mean by remember the future there, but you mean remembering how they want to carry out an imagined future act or something like that.
Yeah. So let's say the example that you gave about a vacation, right? So if you ask an older adult to remember a previous vacation, and they can do that, but not with the level of detail that, say, a younger adult can do on average. And then you ask the older adult to imagine a future vacation, and they can do that, but not at the level that a younger adult could. But if you talk to that individual, the older adult, and had them really work on imagining that future vacation, then it seems like they would be more likely to remember that that vacation after they went on it than if they didn't try to imagine the vacation.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know if that
Yeah,
makes any sense, but
no,
yeah.
yeah, I think the imagining would probably boost subsequent memory for the actual event once it took place. Yes.
And so the same logic is there for someone, a student, for example, who's studying. If they were to imagine what they were trying to learn, like they go through a syllabus or they've read their chapter, those types of things, they're more likely to be able to encode or take in the information once they're actually in the lecture. And
Yeah, for sure.
okay, and I think then from a practical perspective, the same thing is true if somebody walks into a meeting, like in a business environment. They walk into a meeting and they've read the agenda before they go into the meeting. They're more likely to be both connected to the information, and paying attention, and more likely to remember it because of the priming or the pre-queuing, however you want to say it, before they actually walked into the meeting in the first place. Does that make sense as well?
I think that's right. I think I would think of that in terms of what, memory researchers would refer to as activating a schema or prior knowledge, that is always going to help you to encode and retrieve new information. So to the extent that you can do that, with, by engaging in pre-queuing or whatever you want to call it, just preparation, activating relevant knowledge for any upcoming situation is likely to be helpful in allowing you to encode and retrieve that information.
So can we keep this line going with the 7 sins? You've got each of these sins, you've got suggestions as to how you can mitigate each of these as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, let's go back to transience because that's the one that I think affects most people most directly. And one of the things, this also relates to the point of, what some of the important updates have been to the 7 sins over the last 20 years. And one of them refers to something that we've already alluded to, but it's worth emphasizing, and that's the power of retrieval on subsequent retrieval. This is something that psychologists knew about for a long time, but really only came into focus in psychological studies after I wrote the 2001 book. And it's often referred to as the testing effect because the research that demonstrated this showed that for example, if you have people read a story and then you test them, give them an initial test on aspects of that story compared to restudying the information that the folks in the tested group are tested on, what you will see is a reduction in transience, a much shallower forgetting curve for the people in the tested condition compared to the studied condition. So in the study, when you get to restudy the story, that gives you a little boost immediately, but then the information fades really quickly, as opposed to when you're tested on the information from the story, even though you may not initially recall all of it, what you do recall holds up really well over time. So I think that has both been one of the important findings from more recent times that has now had a lot of implications for education, for example. It's been implemented and shown to be effective in the classroom. And it's probably the simplest thing that people can do to try to reduce transience in their own lives, which is try to, in a disciplined way, test themselves, retrieve the information that you want to be able to recall. And if you do that multiple times, there will definitely, or should definitely be, a benefit in reducing the rate of forgetting over time. If there was, one simple way that we could recommend that people could reduce the amount of forgetting over time, it would be self-testing.
So, one of the things I think about is typically in an academic situation, students spend most of their time inputting information. So they listen to a lecture or watch a video of the lecture, they read the notes, they read the book. These are all input types of situations. One of the things that you're suggesting is that they are practicing the output side, actually practicing putting the information out by testing themselves. That would also probably change their arousal state. That would change the perspective or the context of that information and so forth. And so I could kind of see how that would work. Are those some of the explanations behind why the testing effect works?
I think that may be part of it. I think more of the focus is on kind of that the idea that testing allows you to build more elaborative connections to other information would be, another component to it. Although I don't think we have even today a full understanding of why it works. Another way in which testing can be helpful is in just encouraging people to pay attention more on the input side. For example, in a lecture situation. So moving on to, for example, absent-mindedness, one of the interesting developments over the past 2 decades related to absent-mindedness has been the emergence of research on what psychologists call mind wandering. We all know intuitively what mind wandering is. I'm supposed to be focused on a task and my mind drifts off to something unrelated to that task. And when I wrote the book on the 7 sins in 2001, mind wandering was not really an area of research in psychology, but since that time has emerged as a major focal point. And one of the areas in which mind wandering can be very detrimental is the educational domain. So if we're sitting in a lecture or learning online, trying to learn online, and our mind drifts off away from what the lecturer is saying, not shockingly, that's going to produce a reduction in the amount retained from the lecture, and that's been shown many times. So what can you do about it? We took this on in our lab a number of years ago in the context of online learning and did an experiment in which people viewed a video of a statistics lecture. It was broken up into a number of different segments. There were 2 different groups, and one group was told that we're going to periodically test you on this information. We may break up the lecture. The other group was told the same thing, but only the first group actually got intermittently tested on the information. We also probed them on how often they were mind wandering. And what we found was when people were told they were going to be intermittently tested and they actually were intermittently tested, there was a dramatic reduction in mind wandering. They stayed focused on the lecture content, presumably because they wanted to do well on the intermittent tests. So that cut mind wandering in half and produced a significant increase in final test performance, probably because more of a front-end attention effect as opposed to the retrieval effect that we were just talking about for the testing effect. So that's another way in which testing can be useful. I've certainly done that in some of my lectures in classroom settings. And, I think students, they may not always like it, but I think it will generally help them to encode and retain more information, be less absent-minded, and as a result, retain more of the information from the lecture.
It's, I think about, as you're talking about this, the mind wandering and the multitasking that we spoke about earlier, and COVID, right? The COVID education times and students being remote, as you mentioned, and also they have their phones with them. And, just I'm curious as to your thoughts about what the both immediate and long-term impact is of that amount of time that individuals spent in that environment. And now, obviously it's much more pervasive that you're going to have online education and people are going to continue to be multitasking and distracted during those classes.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that, educationally, for those who are, totally restricted to an online setting, that the educational outcomes were not as good as they would have been otherwise through live education. Some of that may be social isolation, for example, as opposed to just the mechanics of learning. But clearly that had, the consequences of COVID and the restrictions to online learning did not have a positive effect on education. So that raises more generally the question of the effect of technology. As you alluded to earlier, people have their phones with them all the time. They're relying on external devices to a greater degree than we have in the past. And what is that doing to our memory, to any of these seven sins that we've talked about? And that's a really interesting topic. There's a lot of worry out there that we may now be in the midst of creating like a generation of what some have referred to as digital amnesics, that if there's a use it or lose it principle to memory, if we're not using it, we might totally lose it at some point. And I think that in principle, there is something to that. The question is, what's the evidence so far that there has actually been a general impact on our ability to retain information over time, for example? Is that being negatively impacted by technology? Are we becoming more absent-minded as a result of our reliance on technology and so forth? So I've looked at that literature pretty carefully, and I think that the answer depends in part on exactly what we mean by a negative effect of technology on memory. So on the one hand, I think it's very clear that specific tasks in which we're relying on technology there may be a detrimental effect on memory. For example, most of us rely on GPS when we're, going to a novel environment. And there is research to indicate that if you're relying on GPS versus navigating a route without GPS, you're probably going to have a less detailed memory of that route when you rely on GPS than when you do it on your own. Does that mean, however, that if we rely on GPS a lot, we're going to have a generally worse memory for spatial information, even outside the context of GPS? Or does that mean that our memory for all kinds of information, even when we're not relying on GPS, is going to be negatively impacted? There, I think it's less clear exactly what's going on. So there is some evidence that people who rely on GPS a lot tend to perform worse on some spatial memory tasks. But there's a chicken and egg problem because we don't really know whether the reason why some people rely on GPS a lot is because they have poor spatial memory and learning abilities, or whether GPS is causing a deficit, for example, in spatial memory and learning, or other kinds of memory and learning. And that has not really been sorted out in the literature. Similarly, you alluded earlier to media multitasking. That's another example where this same issue has come up. We know that if you multitask, for example, during a lecture, again, not surprisingly, you're going to have poor memory for that lecture. If you're looking at your phone, you're not going to retain information from the lecture. So the specific task, no doubt, is impacted negatively by relying on the technology. But if you media multitask a lot, does that mean that there's going to be a broader impairment of your memory abilities? And there we run into the same issue as I alluded to with GPS. There is some evidence that people who media multitask a lot exhibit poor memory performance, even in situations where they're not media multitasking. That might suggest that the multitasking is causing them to have a poor memory in a more general sense. However, the opposite could also be true. The reason why they media multitask stems from poor memory and attentional abilities. They're just less able to focus on any particular task. Poor memory is the result of that. So there's that same chicken and egg problem. That's really what needs to be sorted out in the literature. Now, there is some basis for worry. For example, there are well-known studies in psychology and neuroscience from Eleanor McGuire and her colleagues a number of years ago showing that London taxi drivers who have incredibly detailed spatial knowledge of London had larger hippocampal volume than non-taxi drivers. The hippocampus, of course, is a crucial structure for memory and spatial cognition. And there, they were able to sort of solve the chicken and egg problem pretty effectively by showing that the amount of hippocampal volume increase was associated with the amount of time spent being a taxi driver, suggesting it's an experience-dependent increase rather than the alternative that, well, people with a big hippocampus and good spatial memory abilities are the ones who become taxi drivers. So on the one side, we can show that increase is use dependent, and you get these effects in the hippocampus with corresponding improvements in memory. So it stands to reason that the opposite could be true. It just hasn't really been shown convincingly yet in the literature.
So, it's interesting because we're kind of bouncing back and forth a little bit between memory and learning. And I think a lot of people think of those as the same or certainly very similar. And no doubt we need memory structures that help us with the learning process. But can you talk a little bit about the difference between memory and learning?
Well, what I would do is I would start by saying that there's not just one kind of memory.
Mm-hmm.
Most memory researchers would distinguish between, for example, episodic memory, memory for experiences, semantic memory, general knowledge, procedural memory, where we get more into skill acquisition, priming, and conditioning. And several of the latter that I just mentioned are typically referred to as learning. So, for example, procedural memory, that involves acquisition of skills over time. And we would interchangeably use the term procedural learning. So I think the spirit of learning is more something that takes place over time, not just one shot, although it can occur in one shot. And it doesn't refer merely to the encoding and storage of information as memory does, but refers to some more permanent form of knowledge. So I don't think there's one simple answer to that question, but I think it involves a couple of dimensions of possible difference.
Well, part of the reason why I'm asking is because I'm thinking about the GPS study as an example. And I remember reading a study about two groups of students, and they were both listening to a lecture, and one was told prior to the lecture, by the way, we're videotaping this lecture in case you want to watch it afterwards. And the other group was told it was told nothing, right, as far as the videotape was concerned. And then there was a surprise quiz at the end of the lecture. You know this study, right?
Well, I can guess the outcome.
Yeah.
I know analysis studies. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So what's your guess of the outcome?
If you know it's being videotaped, you'll have worse memory.
Yeah. And it's one of the things we run into this, by the way, at the medical school, or not we, but at medical schools all the time because lectures are taped, and students have a habit of just listening to the videotape lecture at 1.25 speed or something, and rather than paying attention during the actual lecture itself necessarily. And I don't think medical school students are unique at this at all. But the reason that this jumps out at me is because if we're using our GPS, then we are typically taking away a major aspect of learning, and that is making mistakes. Because we know that there is a certain level of making mistakes that actually enhances learning. And so, you said this earlier, the 7 sins, these are essentially mistakes or errors within the memory system, but some of those may be powerful learning variables as well.
Yeah, for sure. And there's very good literature on that. And no question that although, I didn't phrase it in terms of learning, this would be a case in which, we could think about what are the 7 sins of learning? Would they be the same as the 7 sins of memory? But no doubt that errors can, under certain circumstances, be helpful for learning, for sure.
I think about studies like the testing effect that you mentioned that you had done in your lab. As you know, we looked at something similar after your study, and we looked at arousal states as a result of testing, and found that arousal states ticked up a little bit when people thought that they were going to be tested, and that had a powerful learning effect as well. In an applied perspective, I generally recommend to students that they answer or ask a question in class, even if they're only doing it in their head, because they're essentially testing themselves during it. So I think it's really interesting being able to take some of the sins and looking at the ways that we can remedy those from both a memory perspective and a learning perspective as well. So Dan, just a couple of things that I find really interesting stories. I know that you not only have worked with amnesic patients, but you played golf with an amnesic patient at one point. You mind sharing that with us? Because I think this is fascinating. In golf, as you know better than me, the idea is, we should have a short memory, right? We forget about the last shot or whatever it is, but you actually played golf with someone who couldn't form new memories.
Yeah, this was a short memory that none of us would hope to have. This was a patient who I was working with at the Unit for Memory Disorders at the University of Toronto in the early 1980s. He was someone who's in the very early stages of Alzheimer's disease. And at that time, he had on neuropsychological and cognitive testing a fairly selective deficit in episodic memory, but wasn't too bad otherwise. So, he couldn't remember words from a list. He couldn't remember pictures you had shown him, but he would come into the lab and we would talk golf. He was a very avid golfer, and he could converse in a pretty normal way about golf. So I thought, gee, it would be very interesting to take him out on a golf course, because when you think about it, golf involves different kinds of memory, episodic memory for the events of the round, semantic memory, your knowledge of all the jargon and rules of golf, and then, of course, procedural memory, your ability to execute the swing and hit the golf ball. So we went out and we played 2 different rounds, 2 rounds on a local course in Toronto. And what I would do is ask him after each hole to recount what had happened. I would, to get at episodic memory. Also, to get at episodic memory, I would manipulate which one of us teed off first. So on half the holes, I would tee off first, he would tee off second, and he could go immediately and look for his ball without any interruption. The other half of the holes, I would reverse it. So now he would hit, then I would hit, and there would be, some time intervening after he had hit. And so on those 2 tests of episodic memory, he exhibited, a striking deficit, maybe even worse than I would have expected based on his lab results. So he remembered little to nothing at the end of each hole of what had happened on the hole. And then strikingly, in terms of remembering where he'd hit his drive, on those occasions where I hit first and he hit second, he could go out and he found his ball with no problem. He kept it in mind. He had an relatively intact working memory. So if the information was not displaced, he could hold on to it. He'd find his ball. But in those situations where he would hit first and I would hit second, then he typically had no clue exactly where he had hit his ball. And there's one incident I still remember 40 years later very clearly, where he had hit a good drive. He carried over a creek about 140 yards out. For him, that was a pretty long drive. And he knew it was a good drive. He said, boy, I often hit it in that creek. I'm so happy that I was able to hit the ball over the creek. And then I hit my drive, started walking out, turned around, and there he was teeing the ball up again. I said, well, why are you doing that? You just hit a great drive. He said, I did. He had no idea that he had just hit a great drive. So it underscored the magnitude of the episodic memory deficit. And yet the other forms of memory were, as far as I could tell, intact. He used all the jargon appropriately: birdie, divot, tee shot, putt, etc. No problem with that. And he more or less played to his handicap. He typically shoot around 90 to 95, and that's roughly what he shot with me. So it was a nice dissociation of episodic memory from the other forms of memory that fit well with what we were seeing in the laboratory.
So we're coming to a close, unfortunately, here, but I got a couple of quick questions for you. One of the questions I asked you in the very beginning that we talked about was around your favorite memories of golf. And so, to some extent, we were testing your memory there. That wasn't the point of it, but we're testing your memory. And also, you're going to be playing in a tournament in a couple weeks, some of the things that you were thinking about for that as well. How accurate do you think you are in both the your past memory, club championship as a 17-year-old, and your future memory? We'll find out about that one, but how accurate do you think you are in predicting generally, predicting about your memory and also your past memories of those events?
Well, it's interesting. When I won the club championship, it was written up in the newspaper, and so I look at that every day. No, I don't look at the write-up every day, but I've looked at it from time to time.
Yeah.
So I know what my scores were, and I'm not confabulating. I know at least that's what it said in the newspaper. So in terms of the events of that round that were not captured by the score, I remember a few isolated things, but not much, not as much as I would like to. There are a few, frequently retrieved memories of critical shots and so on and so forth, critical situations that I do recall. In terms of future memory, I think all golfers have to be a bit overly optimistic to go out there and do it again. So I probably expect to do better than I will do.
I don't know. I've seen you play pretty well, Dan. I'm looking forward to that. So kind of related to this topic, we love to ask the question, moments of joy. So what are a few moments of joy that you've had in your life? And I know you have two wonderful daughters, a fantastic wife. You can only use one of your moments. I'll give you two moments of them, but what moments of joy do you have in your life?
Oh boy, yeah. I would go to that. Certainly hard to beat the birth of your children, of my two daughters. That certainly would rank, has got to rank very high. And the older daughter recently had her own child, and so now having a granddaughter is something get a great amount of enjoyment from. On a different dimension, and I have to include my wedding in there also, but we'll count that under one moment of joy. I think music is something that's given me a lot of joy over the years. And some of the great concerts I've been to, starting in high school, living outside of New York. One of the great things we were able to do was go into the city and see a lot of amazing jazz, which I was an early fan of and still am. So I think when I think back to some of the great concerts by some of the great jazz artists that I've heard over the years, particularly when I was in high school and going into some of the famous clubs in New York, seeing my favorite jazz musicians, I think that, that gave me a lot of joy.
Okay, Dan, this is a personal favorite of mine, right next to Moment of Joy. Your North Star. What is the thing that guides you for everything you do personally and professionally?
Wow. I don't know that there's any one thing. I think it's mostly been trying to identify things I'm passionate about and really pursue those things with a lot of energy. I think that's probably been the one most guiding principle, and that can be applied to work, to family, to music, to golf, to pretty much anything. But identifying that passion and then trying to kind of encourage it and amplify it.
Do you play musical instruments?
I've played a few from time to time. When I was a kid, I played piano. I took up flute in college, played it for a while, but I'm not active on either one now, but I'm still very active with music as a listener.
I want to just tell you a quick story. You just reminded me of this. I was talking to my dad one day. He's 97, and it was we got talking about the throat and singing for, I don't know why, actually, we did. But when I was a kid, he used to have musicals on a record player. So, for example, South Pacific in Oklahoma and so forth. And for some reason, there was a song from South Pacific that came to mind. And I don't know, we're talking about memory. I don't know where this memory came from, but I started singing South Pacific. This song is Nothing Like a Dame, I think is the name of the thing. But anyway, I started singing this, and Dad started singing along with me. We've never sung together since I was, I don't know, maybe 10 years old, something like that. And it was absolutely such a joyous experience for me to be able to do that. And I asked him, Dad, how do you know all these songs, and why did you like these musicals? So, coming from New Rochelle, same place that you grew up, he and his family, his mom and sister, used to go to Broadway and listen to these musicals. And one of the really interesting things that I found about this experience that I was having in the moment was Dad remembering all of these musicals from, at that point, 80 years before that, more than 80 years before that. And I think about this in context of our whole conversation that we've had, the 7 sins, and certainly he's vulnerable to these along the way, and yet he had such a clear recollection of being able to sing the songs and the train ride into the city and so forth and so on. And I think right now, the feeling that I have is some kind of joy and hope, because maybe the rest of us can be in that shape at some point later on in our lives. And you talking about music and how important that is to you and how that's a moment of joy really brought that back. So I want to say thank you, Dan, for that. I also want to say thank you for being on the podcast. It's, as always, when I talk to you, it's illuminating, and really enjoyed it. So thank you so much.
Likewise, thank you, Mark. It was a pleasure and good to be able to talk about all these interesting topics.
Yeah, agreed. We've got some more time to talk about it later.
Yeah.
So
thank you.